Speaker Mike Johnson just placed a meticulously arranged calendar on the polished mahogany table directly in front of Nancy Pelosi, laying out a devastating, undeniable sequence during a high-stakes congressional hearing. 12 months, 14 highly lucrative stock trades, and one deeply concealed text message between the former speaker and her husband that absolutely no one in Washington knew existed. By the precise moment he finished reading those dates aloud, her trademark expression had vanished. Nancy Pelosi always smiles. She has smiled serenely through bitter impeachment hearings, through grueling government shutdowns, and through 30 uninterrupted years of relentless camera flashes. Yet, she is noticeably not smiling now. I want to address something before the speaker begins. Nancy Pelosi declared initially, and the smile had been firmly in place, just as it had been since the moment she sat down. It was there when she gracefully adjusted her microphone with 2 fingers, crossed her ankles discreetly beneath the heavy wooden table, and folded her hands perfectly in front of her. It was the exact practiced posture of a seasoned woman at a high society dinner party who inherently knows vastly more than everyone else in the room and has simply decided to be gracious about it. That smile lived on her face, the way a fresh coat of premium paint lives on a wall, permanent, flawlessly maintained, and so remarkably consistent that its sudden absence would be vastly more jarring than any alternative expression she could possibly replace it with. My husband is a private citizen. He has been a highly successful investor for over 40 years, and he makes his own investment decisions, she stated, letting each practice clause land with the unhurried, clinical precision of a veteran politician who has uttered this exact sentence or subtle variations of it more times than she could ever possibly count. She fully intended to confidently say it as many more times as necessary to survive the day. I have no involvement in, and absolutely no prior knowledge of, any transaction he makes, she continued, her tone ironclad. This has been repeatedly asked and thoroughly answered. I am here today out of sheer respect for the process, not because there is anything fundamentally new to discuss. She had just confidently declared on the record that her husband makes his own independent decisions. However, sitting rigidly across from her, Speaker Johnson possessed physical documentation of 14 distinct stock trades resting squarely in front of him, every single one exquisitely timed to coincide with consequential legislation she directly controlled. More damningly, he held the printout of one specific text message she had personally sent the very night before the largest financial maneuver of them all. Mike Johnson's papers were arranged in a stack so immaculate that their sharp edges looked as though they could have been cut by a surgical laser. He sat poised behind them, framed by his classic horn-rimmed glasses, his crisp sleeves firmly buttoned all the way to the wrist, and his tie pulled tight to the collar. He looked exactly like what he truly was. A meticulous constitutional lawyer hailing from Shreveport, Louisiana, a man who had spent 20 quiet years diligently reading complex statutes in rooms far less grand than this magnificent chamber. Over those 2 decades, he had carefully developed the devastating habit of simply letting the cold, hard law do all the talking so that he never had to. Mrs. Pelosi, I want to begin with a specific statute. He announced smoothly as he opened the very first page, the Stock Act, Public Law 112 to 105, officially signed into law on the 4th of April, 2012. Its full title is the Stop Trading on Congressional Knowledge Act. He briefly looked up through his lenses, his gaze piercing. Are you intimately familiar with it? At this point, the painted smile did not even flinch. I helped pass it, Mr. Speaker, she countered effortlessly. Yes, ma'am, you absolutely did, and I highly appreciate that specific fact because it means you know exactly, word for word, what it says, Johnson replied without missing a beat. He looked back down and read directly from the pristine page. In relevant part, the Stock Act expressly provides that members of Congress and their spouses are strictly prohibited from using non-public information derived from their official position for private, personal profit. He paused, letting the heavy legal jargon settle into the quiet room. That is the law. You wrote it. I am extremely well aware of what the law says, Pelosi shot back. Good. Johnson nodded slightly as he deliberately turned the page. Then let's talk about the calendar. He began to read the very first pair of dates in a tone strikingly reminiscent of a tired schoolteacher reading morning attendance, flat, undeniably specific, and expecting absolutely nothing in return except the unvarnished record, the 18th of June, 2020. Your husband, Paul Pelosi, purchased between $1 million and $5 million in highly lucrative call options for Alphabet, the massive parent company of Google. He set the crisp page softly down on the polished table and smoothed it once with his fingertips, acting with the precise, methodical nature of a man who alphabetizes his physical files and respects the brutal truth of paper. Several weeks later, the influential House Antitrust Subcommittee, over which you wielded significant, undeniable influence regarding the legislative agenda, conveniently elected not to advance sweeping legislation that would have been tremendously unfavorable to large technology companies, explicitly including Google. He then carefully placed a second page right beside the first, creating two striking white rectangles starkly contrasting against the dark mahogany wood. Trade date clearly printed on the left, legislative date neatly aligned on the right. He meticulously adjusted their edges until they were perfectly parallel, the 19th of March, 2021. Your husband successfully purchased between $1 and $5 million in call options for Microsoft. A new page was drawn from the stack, resulting in the exact same placement and the exact same geometric alignment. He was systematically building something undeniable on that table, not a mere pile of random papers, but a brutal chronological sequence. Each pair of pages represented a definitive station in a damning timeline that was rapidly starting to develop a hypnotic, terrifying rhythm. The rhythm was as relentless as a metronome. Trade, legislation, trade, legislation. More importantly, the suspiciously convenient gap between each pair of dates was always measured in a few short weeks, never drawn out months, and absolutely never a distance large enough to be politely dismissed as mere coincidence-sized. Several weeks later, Johnson's voice droned on. Microsoft was officially awarded a massive $22 billion contract with the United States Army, a massive defense contract, closely overseen by the very committee structure you unilaterally controlled as Speaker of the House. He did not dramatically pause for cheap emphasis. He did not forcefully raise his voice or softly lower it for theatrical effect. He simply laid the dates down the way a seasoned bricklayer lays heavy bricks, one after another, perfectly level, absolutely plumb, with each solid fact structurally supporting the undeniable one that immediately followed. By the time he reached the third pair of dates, the breathless people in the committee room had entirely stopped looking at the individual pages and had started staring intensely at the emerging pattern. The pages were merely raw data, but the undeniable pattern was a crushing verdict. The 17th of June, 2022, Johnson continued relentlessly. Your husband purchased between $1 and $5 million in call options for NVIDIA, a prominent semiconductor company. He looked up slowly, peering over the thick rims of his glasses. Several weeks later, the House formally voted on the CHIPS and Science Act, a sprawling $52 billion federal subsidy directly benefiting the semiconductor industry. He locked eyes with her. You, sitting as Speaker, wholly controlled the floor schedule. You personally decided exactly when that pivotal bill came to a final vote, and your husband magically bought the underlying stock a mere 3 weeks before you brought it forward. On the crowded press row, a veteran female reporter abruptly took her hands entirely off her glowing keyboard, resting them limply in her lap. She sat perfectly still, staring blankly at the bright screen in front of her, which still displayed the very last half-finished sentence she had frantically typed, too stunned to continue. Then came a fourth devastating page. September 2024. Your husband strategically sold more than $500,000 in Visa stock. Johnson's voice tightened infinitesimally. The following day, not the following week, Mrs. Pelosi, but the very following day, the Department of Justice officially filed a massive antitrust lawsuit against Visa. He let the incredible proximity of the dates hang in the chilled air. Your husband magically sold the stock exactly 24 hours before the crippling lawsuit was publicly announced. 24 hours. There now sat 4 pairs of pages on the desk, creating 8 stark white rectangles forming 2 relentless columns. Trade date on the left, legislation date on the right, running parallel straight down the long table like clearly painted lanes on an endless highway. The distance between those 2 dangerous lanes was always suspiciously the same, a matter of weeks, sometimes merely days, but absolutely never long enough to be classified as a blind accident. 4 trades. Mrs. Pelosi, Johnson summarized coldly. 4 entirely different companies. 4 distinctly different economic sectors, 4 vastly different years. He leaned forward slightly, and in every single isolated case, your husband's brilliant trade remarkably anticipated a major congressional action that you were uniquely in a position to know about long before the general public ever knew about it. Slowly, he took off his glasses and set them gently on top of the neat stack. The incredibly small, sharp click of the metal hinges folding together was the absolute only sound in the cavernous room that was not the dull hum of the air conditioning. That is not a lucky streak, Mrs. Pelosi. Johnson stated with chilling finality. That is a calendar. The famous smile was technically still there, but it was visibly thinner now. It looked the way a thick coat of premium paint noticeably thins when you aggressively sand it down, right when the raw grain of the rough wood underneath finally starts to bleed through, damaged but stubbornly clinging on. Mr. Speaker Pelosi's voice immediately fired back, carrying the particular unshakable smoothness of old money and decades of long, hard practice. It was the unmistakable voice of a powerful woman who has spent a lifetime explaining complex things to rooms full of lesser people who fundamentally understand less than she does, doing it for so long that the forced patience itself has seamlessly morphed into a blunt form of absolute authority. She smoothly unfolded her perfectly manicured hands and refolded them, a subtle micro-adjustment, a physical recalibration, the exact kind of calculated thing a powerful person does when they desperately want the entire room to clearly see that their hands are rock steady and their regal posture has not changed an inch. My husband has been an incredibly successful investor for 40 years, she reiterated firmly. He successfully managed vast capital long before I ever entered Congress, and I assure you, he will continue to manage it long after I eventually leave. He built a prominent venture capital firm with his own 2 hands and his own impeccable judgment. Her tone sharpened into a blade. And the baseless suggestion, the insulting implication that a grown man with 4 decades of top-tier professional investment experience somehow cannot make a single financial decision without first consulting his wife is frankly deeply patronizing. As she delivered the stinging rebuke, the smile artificially widened by exactly 1 rigid degree. It did not grow warmer. It merely stretched wider, exactly the way a heavy door opens just a bit wider, when someone specifically wants you to clearly see what is hiding behind it. We firmly exist in a free market economy, Mr. Speaker, she lectured. That is not merely a Republican principle or a Democratic principle. It is a foundational American principle. And duly elected members of Congress should absolutely be able to freely participate in the very economy they tirelessly serve. Directly behind her, an eager young staffer nervously adjusted a thick folder on the table. The staffer did not open it. They just anxiously straightened it, squaring its cardboard edges the exact same way Johnson had so methodically squared his own imposing stack. It was the transparent, desperate gesture of a loyal person who desperately wants to believe their side has just forcefully put the chaotic universe back into its proper order. Johnson calmly waited for the frantic gesture to finish. He deliberately let the staffer's trembling hand completely finish its journey back to the safety of the table before he slowly opened his mouth. Then he uttered one single devastating sentence. "I fundamentally agree with the free market, Mrs. Pelosi," Johnson replied evenly. "What I absolutely do not agree with is a rigged market where one specific player miraculously gets to read all the cards before the hand is even dealt." The staffer's hand instantly froze on the folder, utterly paralyzed, and did not dare straighten anything else for the rest of the hearing. "I'd like to talk about sheer scale," Johnson pivoted seamlessly, his tone never rising. He carefully pulled a crisp new page from the top of the stack, utilizing the deliberate, cautious care of a focused man who organizes vital things alphabetically and absolutely means it. "Mrs. Pelosi, for the record, what is your approximate total net worth?" She bristled. "I do not publicly discuss my private personal finances in this type of setting, Mr. Speaker," she snapped defensively. Johnson didn't miss a beat. "Your official financial disclosures are a matter of permanent public record, ma'am. They legally have to be, specifically because you literally wrote the very law that aggressively requires them." He let that brutal irony land heavily in the room. For the second time in minutes, her very own champion legislation had been violently turned backward like a weapon against her. And the crushing pattern of it, much like the damning pattern of the stock trades, was rapidly starting to accumulate its own inescapable, suffocating gravity. Quiver, Quantitative, an independent firm which closely tracks congressional stock holdings utilizing your very own mandatory disclosure filings, conservatively estimates your personal net worth at approximately $260 million, he stated, setting the colossal number down softly on the hard table, the careful way one sets down a glass that is filled entirely to the absolute brim, hyper-aware of the catastrophic mess that might spill. Your official congressional salary is exactly $174,000 a year. You have proudly served for 37 long years. He looked directly into her eyes. If you had miraculously saved every single dollar of every single taxpayer paycheck for 37 consecutive years, paying absolutely zero taxes, zero rent, buying zero food, zero gas, zero clothes, and buying absolutely zero ice cream, you would have accumulated a maximum of approximately $6.4 million. He let the silence amplify the math. He looked up. Your net worth is $260 million. That is a staggering 40 times what you could have conceivably earned in an entire frugal lifetime of dedicated congressional service. He shook his head slowly. The basic math, Mrs. Pelosi, simply does not work. Not on a standard government salary. Not in this known universe. My husband is a massively successful, she started to interject. Johnson smoothly cut her off, his voice cutting like a scalpel. Your husband's most astonishingly successful investments just coincidentally happen to perfectly align with sweeping legislation you personally controlled. That is not brilliant business, Mrs. Pelosi. That is a blatant cheat code. Up on the press row, a seasoned male reporter silently closed his leather notebook and gripped it tightly shut with both trembling hands, his thumbs pressing fiercely into the hard cover as if he feared the explosive notebook might spontaneously burst open entirely on its own. Johnson silently turned yet another page. In the bleak, terrifying month of April 2020, while the vital federal Paycheck Protection Program had disastrously run completely out of emergency money and terrified small businesses across the heart of America were forcefully locking their front doors while desperate local barbers, struggling florists, and exhausted diner owners were tearfully taping sad, handwritten signs in their dark windows that read, "Closed until further notices," you infamously appeared on broadcast national television. He did not sneer. He did not raise an eyebrow. You stood comfortably in front of your sprawling $24,000 luxury Sub-Zero refrigerator, enthusiastically showing a financially bleeding country your vast, elite collection of $13 a pint boutique ice cream. He utterly refused to editorialize. He strictly read the stark numbers the exact same way he had read every other damning number that morning. Flat, perfectly calibrated, completely devoid of emotion. It was the commanding voice of a steadfast man who fundamentally believes that raw facts do not require flowery adjectives and massive dollar signs do not require snarky commentary. A $24,000 refrigerator, $13 a pint ice cream, the desperate Paycheck Protection Program entirely empty, thousands of small family businesses permanently closing, your massive luxury freezer totally full. He set the heavy page down, the sound echoing lightly. Meanwhile, your own suffering constituents. Right in San Francisco, statistically one of the most painfully expensive cities on planet Earth, are forced to literally step over broken human beings, tragically sleeping in squalid tents right on the concrete sidewalk on their daily commute to work every single morning. He pressed the undeniable contrast further. A cramped, tiny studio apartment in your own home district impossibly costs $2,800 a month just to rent. And your personal kitchen freezer alone costs vastly more than what some of those desperately struggling people make in half a grueling year. The painted practice smile was technically still plastered on Pelosi's tense face, but a veteran reporter sitting in the crowded third row, a sharp-eyed woman who had meticulously covered Nancy Pelosi for 11 long years and intrinsically knew the complex internal architecture of that famous smile, the exact same way a master structural engineer intuitively knows crucial load-bearing walls, quickly scribbled 3 urgent words in the narrow margin of her notebook and frantically circled them twice. Smile is thinning. Then the true kill shot arrived. Johnson deliberately reached far beneath the neat stack and slowly brought out one single, isolated page. He purposefully held it silently in the air without reading a single word of it for 3 agonizingly long seconds. It was the absolute only unscripted pause he had taken all grueling morning that was a fraction longer than the natural cadence of a sentence required. That heavy, pregnant pause itself was a blaring, deafening kind of announcement, largely because Mike Johnson was not a man who naturally paused. Mike Johnson systematically read dense statutes, endless dates, and massive dollar amounts at the blistering speed of a focused man who has a terrifying amount of heavy material to read and simply not much time to do it. And so when he finally stopped, the sudden, unnatural stopping violently carried its own suffocating weight. "Mrs. Pelosi," he said, his voice dropping slightly in pitch, "I am now going to slowly read a direct, private text message exchange strictly between you and your husband." He tapped the paper. It was legally and properly obtained by this investigative committee, straight from a verified device backup, officially produced under a lawful federal subpoena during a closely related investigation. Suddenly, Pelosi's left hand, which had been resting perfectly still, perfectly composed on the polished table, jerked involuntarily and moved to the sharp edge of the wood. Her manicured fingers blindly found the hard edge and firmly anchored themselves there, white-knuckling the mahogany. Johnson began to read. His steady voice was the exact same monotonous voice it had been for the entire marathon hearing. Highly measured, completely unhurried. It was the relaxed casual voice of a man quietly reading a dry legal brief to a bored colleague over a simple sandwich at lunch. And the total chilling absence of any theatrical drama in his delivery somehow made the explosive words echo infinitely louder than any screaming, raised voice ever possibly could have. The late evening of the 16th of June, 2022, Johnson recited, "The very night right before your husband conveniently purchased between $1 and $5 million in highly profitable NVIDIA call options, he slowly adjusted his thick glasses at exactly 9:47 p. Your husband urgently texts you the following question. Is the chip thing going to move this session or get pushed?" He set the printout of the first text message down on the table and methodically picked up the next printed sheet. You subsequently respond at exactly 9:52 p.m. He read her damning reply in the exact same manner a bored person casually reads a basic soup recipe, flat, completely domestic. It was the mundane, casual language of a private household, utterly devoid of the gravity of a powerful government. It's moving. Schumer confirmed the Senate schedule today. We'll have floor action within 3 weeks. Should be a big number. Somewhere high up in the packed public gallery, a tense man nervously leaned back in his wooden chair, and the dry wood sharply creaked. That singular, sharp creak violently traveled through the suffocatingly quiet room, the exact same terrifying way a jagged crack violently travels across a sheet of thin, dangerously fragile ice, rapidly spreading, totally irreversible. Your husband enthusiastically responds at 9:53 p.m. with exactly 3 words. Johnson continued mercilessly, refusing to let the tension break. He read them plainly. Good to know. Johnson paused. 3 incredibly simple words. They were the exact kind of mundane, everyday words a normal person casually says when someone casually tells them it's probably going to rain tomorrow. Good to know. I'll make sure to bring a sturdy umbrella. I'll make sure to buy the $1 million stock. Johnson slowly looked up from the printed page, staring directly at the former speaker. He read the final, devastating exchange excruciatingly slowly. He treated each individual word as if it were a massive, heavy, separate physical object being carefully set down on a fragile shelf, intentionally spaced far apart so that the very dead air between them could adequately carry the crushing weight of their implication. You respond at 9:54 p.m. with exactly 7 words, he stated quietly. He read them to the silent room. But don't do anything I'm going to have to answer questions about. He slowly set the final page down right at the far end of the meticulous row. There were exactly 9 stark white rectangles carefully laid out now, the 8 original paired date pages, and this newest one, slightly smaller. It was a raw text message printout, highly informal, with the digital timestamps clearly visible in faded gray type, the exact kind of utterly mundane document that looks remarkably like a harmless grocery list, right up until you actually read the horrifying words printed on it. But don't do anything I'm going to have to answer questions about. He deliberately said it a second time, utilizing the exact same tone, at the exact same agonizing speed. The repetition was absolutely not for cheap theatrical emphasis. Johnson simply did not do dramatic emphasis. The repetition was strictly for the official record. It was for the frantic stenographer rapidly typing. It was for the permanent historical transcript. It was for the damning, immortal document that would permanently exist long after all the bright television cameras were finally turned off. You absolutely did not say, "Don't trade." Johnson pointed out ruthlessly, you absolutely did not logically say that is highly sensitive, non-public information, and I cannot legally share it with you. He let the omissions burn. You did not boldly say the Stock Act explicitly prohibits this exact behavior. He locked eyes with her again. You completely failed to say any of the standard ethical things. The very law, the exact law you enthusiastically helped write, strictly requires you to say, he slowly took off his glasses again, holding them loosely in one hand. His hand was perfectly still in that remarkably calm way that hands are only still when they are not artificially performing calmness, but simply have absolutely nothing left to frantically do. You explicitly said, don't do anything I'm going to have to answer questions about. He leaned in, delivering the fatal blow. That is absolutely not the innocent text message of a totally uninvolved woman who has strictly no involvement in her husband's lucrative trades, Mrs. Pelosi. That is the damning text message of a deeply compromised woman who has just covertly handed her eager husband a highly valuable piece of strictly non-public information and desperately wants to make entirely sure nobody ever finds out about it. Your only concern, your absolute only ethical concern in that entire exchange was simply not getting caught. Nancy Pelosi's left hand, which had been resting firmly on the sharp edge of the table ever since Johnson first began reading the messages, violently pressed down so hard that her fingertips instantly whitened, entirely drained of blood. And in that exact devastating fraction of a second, the legendary, immortal smile finally left Nancy Pelosi's face. It absolutely did not slowly fade. It did not gradually thin any further. It vanished entirely all at once. It vanished the exact same abrupt way a bright light instantly goes out when an unseen hand violently rips the power cord straight from the wall. It died the way a glowing computer screen instantly goes pitch dark when the massive city power grid totally cuts out. It escaped her face the exact same desperate way a suffocating person who has been stubbornly holding their breath underwater for a dangerously long time finally, involuntarily, uncontrollably lets it all go. One fleeting moment, it was firmly there, exactly the way it had perpetually always been there. The very way it had proudly been there for 30 long years of grueling hearings, hostile press conferences, grand State of the Union addresses, and in the bright lens of absolutely every single camera that had ever dared point at her and always found her flawlessly ready. And then, shockingly, it was completely gone. And what was terrifyingly revealed underneath that vanished smile was absolutely nothing. Not fiery anger, not creeping fear, not profound grief, not even the kind of raw human vulnerability that might possibly make a flawed person somewhat sympathetic to the public. It was just a cold, absolute nothingness. It was a terrifying stillness, so profound, so utterly complete, and so bizarrely foreign to the familiar landscape of Nancy Pelosi's face that the veteran reporter sitting right in the very front row, the precise one who had diligently covered her every move for 11 uninterrupted years, completely stopped writing and just openly stared in sheer disbelief. And what that stunned reporter witnessed was something she had fundamentally never, ever seen in over a decade of exhaustive daily coverage. She saw the completely raw, unvarnished surface of an aging face that had stubbornly worn the exact same defensive expression for so incredibly long that when the protective mask was finally brutally removed, there was absolutely nothing left behind it to logically take its place. It was entirely bare walls. It was an echoing, empty room. It was the hollow, decaying architecture of a massive 30-year political career, suddenly exposed with all the lavish furniture ruthlessly taken out. Don't do anything I'm going to have to answer questions about. That is exactly what she had texted her millionaire husband the very night before he conveniently bought $5 million in rapidly surging semiconductor stock. And sitting directly across from her, Speaker Mike Johnson had just mercilessly read it permanently into the immortal congressional record. The live stream chat exploded with a single brutal sentiment: subscribe. She hasn't smiled since. Johnson did not triumphantly stand up to gloat. He remained calmly seated in his large leather chair. His reading glasses rested quietly on the table right beside the damning stack of paper. His hands were neatly folded together, and the volume of his steady voice had not changed a single decibel in the entire brutal hearing. It certainly did not change now. The Stock Act, he summarized coldly, Public Law 112 to 105, which you personally helped pass, which explicitly says that sitting members of Congress and their spouses are strictly prohibited from illegally using non-public information for private personal profit. He let the heavy legal statute sit heavily in the air. 14 unbelievably timed trades across 4 distinct years. Every single one miraculously timed perfectly to sweeping legislation you completely controlled, personally sponsored, or had intimate, advanced knowledge of. A staggering net worth of $260 million built on a modest taxpayer salary of $174,000. A lavish $24,000 luxury refrigerator stuffed completely full of $13 boutique ice cream, residing right in a crumbling city where desperate people freeze to death, sleeping under concrete highway overpasses. And finally, a highly secretive text message directly from you to your husband, sent the very night before, a massive trade worth between $1 and $5 million that literally says in your very own typed words, "Don't do anything I'm going to have to answer questions about." He paused, letting the devastating summary settle over her. "You have confidently answered many questions today, Mrs. Pelosi," Johnson concluded smoothly, "but you absolutely have not answered that one. And I firmly do not believe you possibly can." He calmly set his glasses right back on top of the stack and firmly folded his hands one last time. The Stock Act says exactly what it says. The calendar says exactly what it says. The text message says exactly what it says. I have absolutely nothing further to add. The committee chairman quietly leaned into his microphone, his voice barely a whisper in the stunned room, and politely asked the gentlewoman from California whether she formally wished to respond to the allegations. Nancy Pelosi slowly opened her mouth. "I have proudly served this great country," she aggressively began. And then, shockingly, she just completely stopped. And this sudden, jarring stop was absolutely not like any of the strategic stops in any of the countless political stories that had ever come before. Because Pelosi definitively did not stop because she merely lost a specific word, or temporarily lost her volume, or suddenly lost her legendary iron nerve. She violently stopped because the very next word in that rehearsed sentence, the precise, lofty word that was fundamentally supposed to seamlessly come right after country, the exact self-righteous word she had automatically placed directly after country in 1,000 triumphant speeches, in 100 combative press conferences, and in literally every single public interview she had confidently given since 1987, was supposed to be with integrity. And she simply could not physically say it. The ghost of the word was right there. She could physically feel it lodged violently in her dry throat, tense in the tight muscles of her locked jaw, taking shape in the very way her quivering lips were already instinctively beginning to form the familiar vowels. But right there, precisely in the microscopic gap between the initial brain impulse and the actual vocal sound, something massive forcefully intervened, the text message. Those 7 horrifying, undeniable words, now permanently sitting in the immortal congressional record, sitting right there on the dark table, directly in front of her in sharp black type on bright white paper. And she instantly understood, possessing the terrifying razor-sharp precision of a brilliant woman who has successfully navigated 30 treacherous years of cutthroat Washington politics, and who intrinsically knows exactly what hard evidence truly means the exact second it officially enters the legal record, that if she dared to publicly utter the phrase with integrity, that exact text message would violently contradict it before the second syllable even fully left her dry mouth. She inhaled sharply, She nervously adjusted her microphone, even though the metal stem had absolutely not moved a single millimeter since the very beginning of the lengthy hearing. Her right hand erratically flew up to her perfectly styled hair. It found one single strand that was already perfectly in place, not a fraction of a millimeter out of strict alignment, and she lightly touched it, awkwardly releasing it. The clumsy gesture was the glaringly transparent gesture of a panicked person whose desperate hands urgently needed something trivial to do precisely because her practiced words could no longer provide the necessary cover. The pristine strand of hair was a flimsy excuse, and the excuse was blatantly, painfully transparent, and she horrifyingly knew it was fully transparent to the entire watching world. But she frantically did it anyway, simply because her trembling hands had absolutely nowhere else to safely go. I stand by my record, she finally choked out 4 incredibly weak words. It was, by far, the shortest, most defensive sentence she had spoken all grueling morning. And crucially, the legendary smile absolutely did not return. It stubbornly stayed wherever it had magically gone, and the exposed, aging face it cruelly left behind was a starkly vulnerable face the television cameras had fundamentally never seen before, and it was a raw face the unforgiving cameras would absolutely never, ever forget. By nightfall, the explosive congressional hearing had already fractured the internet into 2 unstoppable viral phenomena, fundamentally altering the landscape of modern political accountability. The first was a blistering 40-second clip capturing the exact agonizing quarter second when Nancy Pelosi's legendary manufactured smile completely shattered into a cold, bare panic, abruptly exposing the hollow architecture of a carefully guarded 30-year political career. The second was a devastating 14-minute masterclass of undeniable legal evidence, a relentless methodical alignment of massive stock trades and legislative dates that immediately triggered a catastrophic political fallout. As the sheer crushing weight of a sudden SEC inquiry and a miraculously rare bipartisan push to permanently ban congressional stock trading sent violent shockwaves through the highest corridors of Washington, the sickening reality of the scandal fully set in across the country. This bitter truth was perfectly encapsulated by a deeply exhausted working-class man named Ray, who sat completely alone in his cramped, suffocating apartment, numbly listening to the hum of his $400 refrigerator. He could only stare blankly at a screen that brutally juxtaposed his permanent $40,000 pandemic life savings loss against Paul Pelosi's perfectly timed $5.3 million NVIDIA windfall. This unforgiving contrast of 2 entirely different economic realities, one forced to operate totally blind in a bleeding, terrifying market, and the other safely guided by the ultimate legislative cheat code, echoed loudly in the heavy quiet of the Capitol. There, Speaker Mike Johnson sat entirely alone in the fading evening light, reflecting on the sheer devastating gravity of those 7 careless words now permanently etched into the immortal congressional record. Don't do anything I'm going to have to answer questions about. Meanwhile, 3,000 miles away in her opulent Napa Valley estate, a frantic Pelosi paced her state-of-the-art kitchen, screaming into a secure phone as she finally realized that absolutely no amount of elite legal maneuvering or practiced artificial smiling could ever logically erase the undeniable math of a $260 million fortune built on a modest taxpayer salary, 14 miraculously timed trades, and 1 catastrophic text message. The video feed may have abruptly cut to black, leaving millions of viewers boiling in pure outrage and desperately begging for the next revelation. But the most terrifying question now suffocating the elite political class isn't what Pelosi will forcefully say to the hungry cameras tomorrow morning. Instead, the true nightmare keeping Washington awake tonight is who else, just realized, with a sudden, sickening drop in their stomach that their very own heavily guarded financial miracles and hastily deleted text messages might already be sitting in a meticulously alphabetized stack on Mike Johnson's heavy wooden desk, simply waiting for the cameras to roll again.